Hello, Finn. So good to see you, and welcome to Queerly Beloved.
Hello, it's great to see you too.
How's your day going? How are things?
Today is going well. It is nice and warm outside, which is a change,
Yeah, I
but
love
it's
that
good.
you guys on the East Coast are experiencing warm, sunny weather, while us on the West Coast have gray skies and rain. It's a nice little flip in the narrative, if you will.
Yeah,
And I think we're going to be talking about some flips and narratives throughout this conversation. So it's a kind of appropriate too. So yeah, it's,
yeah.
it's really great to connect with you again. And as I like to start all my interviews with, I'd love you to answer the question, who are you in this moment? But tell me by describing the perfect drag avatar.
By describing the perfect drag avatar, the way that I see myself is, like if you have a seed and it's under the ground, and so there's a little bit sticking out and a little bit of root, but none of it's poking through the surface. So
Mm.
I don't know how that would quite translate. I think it could actually be quite a beautiful drag situation, but that is how I feel right now.
Oh, I love that so much, Finn. Thank you. I appreciate, I've certainly had folks respond with animals and different creatures, maybe mythological creatures. Yeah, I've had dragon, I've had flying horse, I believe. And I've never had a drag avatar from the animal kingdom or from the plant kingdom. So that's really fantastic. I appreciate that. Yeah, and we'll get more into what that represents if that is to be. I'll share for myself. I'm really just feeling all this rain. It just feels so good to have this element of water. And today's a full moon, and it's sort of
Yeah.
a chaotic, unpredictable full moon energy. But there's
Yeah.
something really soothing and playful about this rain kind of swirling and moving the energy, moving the emotions. And so my drag avatar, since you went with a plant, I'm going to go into an element, which is this sort of like water creature, which is like the swirling, moving water creature, and sort of being one with this changing of energies. That's sort of where I'm at today.
Yeah. That sounds powerful.
Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you. Yeah, I'd love for you to share a little bit more about some of the seeds and some of what's going on in your life currently.
Sure. Absolutely. So let's see. Um, One of the big things going on for me is that I'm pregnant. So I am a pregnant trans guy. And one of the interesting things about that is that my body is very visibly pregnant, but nobody notices.
Mm,
And that's why I think the metaphor of a seed that's under the surface
mm,
feels very potent for me. Another thing that is really important to me in my life right now is my writing. So I
mm,
put out a weekly essay on my newsletter, which is called the Menstruant. And I called it that because I love cycles. And as soon as I learned that word, which is obviously often associated with menstruation, but it really means someone who has monthly cycles. And so I
mm.
choose to take a broader interpretation of that than some people might. But I love the word, so I chose it for my newsletter. And my newsletter is about what does it mean to be a gay man who loves having a uterus.
Mm.
And so that encompasses my pregnancy, but it encompasses other aspects as well of having a trans body, of being a queer person, of even the word love. All of those words feel very important to me.
Mm.
And so with that also, it feels like it's germinating. So
Mhm.
I think that's another reason I chose the seed metaphor is that there's always a lot of activity happening before even just a small sprout posts through the surface. And
Mhm.
so that's something I'm really kind of coming back to right now.
Mhm.
I think another thing I like about plants is that there's so many ways in which we look at linearity.
Mhm.
And so we look at something has to kind of grow and then it's, done and it's successful or unsuccessful. But a plant, they have a plant life cycle. So they're under the ground for part of it, they grow, they also wilt, and all of that is okay. And so I like to kind of come back to that for myself in a culture that so deeply values linearity instead.
Oh, so good. So many good things here. Will you share the word that word again?
Yeah, menstruant. So it's like menstruation, but like Menstruant. And I got it from certain anthropological texts will use
Mhm,
this word when they look at like menstrual rituals and stuff like
mhm,
that, but it kind of fell out of favor.
mhm.
So, a more classic definition is like someone who is menstruating or who can menstruate. But, I have found definitions that just like someone who has a monthly cycle, which, maybe they were trying to be uh like avoid the word or concept of period. But I was like, I'm into that.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think for me as like a queer trans man, I have felt very set apart by having a body that like has a uterus or is capable of menstruating. And so I think I chose it to kind of claim that for myself and be like,
Mhm.
well, I'm the menstruant. Um, but I also just really love the word and concept because of the way that so often this isn't discussed, both like menstruation, but also just cycles in general in a world that's so focused on linearity. And so I think that when we reclaim our relationship to cycles, regardless of what those look like in our lives, we have a source of power.
Absolutely. Yeah. As I mentioned, I'm out here in San Diego where we don't have many seasons, right? We typically have just sunny Groundhog Day. And I have spent so much of my time on the East Coast where I did have the pleasure of experiencing the different seasons. And it's always interesting for me as we're moving into fall, looking for the nuances and trying to like feel into some change so that I can embrace the season
Yeah.
and the cycles. And I just really appreciate this reclaiming of cycles, of being a person who is in a cyclical relationship with life. And in a sense, we all are. And yet, some of us aren't aware of it, and some of us aren't tending to it. And so I just appreciate this idea of using this word but reclaiming it in this way that gives a broader demographic permission to claim themselves as people in a cyclical relationship with life. I'm just curious if you could speak more about your take on cyclical versus linear, and why that's an important thing to put some thought into.
Yeah. So one thing that I wrote about recently in my newsletter is, as someone who's currently pregnant, I feel like I keep being invited into a linear narrative about that. I
Mhm.
feel like basically the as a writer, I always look at narrative structures. And so the narrative structure that I'm offered around pregnancy is basically like a male orgasm. Like you basically like get bigger and bigger and then you like explode and
Mhm.
then like you have a baby or whatever.
Yes.
And I was like, I wonder if there are other narrative structures that I can offer myself that might feel more nourishing and grounding for me. And so
Mm.
I actually turned to some books that look at narrative structure. So Meander, Spiral, Explode, I believe it's by Jane Allison, that points out that not every narrative has to have a linear pattern or a singular climax. Um, and so I thought about that, in what ways can I look at my pregnancy as a cycle by perhaps expanding the lens, looking at a broader lens in the same way that if you just saw a flower bloom, you would have one narrative about it. But if you look at the whole plant life cycle, you would have a very different narrative.
Mhm.
Um, and also really looking at the way that pregnancy is seen as this growth or kind of gaining something, but it's equally the process of losing. I'm losing a certain relationship with my body. I'm losing the ability to do certain things, and I'm okay with that. This is a choice that I made, but I want to make space for the fact that that's part of my situation as well.
Mm.
And so for me, the relationship of being in relationship with cycles allows me to make space for more complexity
Mhm.
and to let me really acknowledge that I can be doing something I want to do, and there could still be grief attached to that. Or just because I am moving in a certain direction doesn't mean that I have to move in that direction forever. So it really allows me a lot more flexibility and groundedness,
Mm.
and just lets me show up more authentically to my life.
Mm. Yeah, what is coming up for me as you describe this is a fuller embrace of all that is. In a sense, perhaps, I'm curious if this resonates with you, but a sense, the linear path is actually not real. That a linear mindset is not very applicable to most things. That the truth of reality is actually much more cyclical and much more all-encompassing. And yet, as humans, we've tried to put a line so that we can feel more control and more like tangibility with a beginning,
Right.
middle, and end. And yet the reality is much more all-encompassing. And I'm just curious if that resonates. And yeah, maybe we can riff on that from kind of a spiritual perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as a writer, I'm very interested in narrative. So on one hand, I
Mhm.
think it's possible that we have a desire or a need to see ourselves as kind of on a particular path or like going somewhere. But at
Uh-huh.
the same time, can we meet that need without buying too far into that and thinking, oh, I have to stay on this path, or if I make a change, I'm off the path, or things like that. And since you invited the conversation to look at this in terms of spirituality, one of the things that I think about is that for over a decade, I was in a Zen Buddhist tradition that was very linear and hierarchical in a way. So, there was a strong focus, of course, on meditation, being with what is, being present. That was what really resonated with me. At the same time, it was very clear kind of who was ahead of you, or like you were on a path you were on a path, and maybe this year you would do this service position, and then next year you could do one that was maybe a little bit more complicated, or you felt like you were kind of getting somewhere. And
Mhm.
so even though on one hand there was this teaching about being very present, there was also this idea of making progress,
Mhm.
and you weren't really supposed to think about it, but it was also kind of there. And I think at that time, I really wanted a container. Containers can be useful. And so I had a lot of things to figure out about myself. I was in my early 20s. I was trying to figure out about my gender.
Mhm.
And so I wanted to kind of get on somebody else's train.
Mhm.
I wanted to show up and be like, this is what you do. And, don't do it this way, do it this way. And if I wanted that sense that if I just showed up and did as I was told, I would eventually get somewhere, like kind of that I was on a train.
Sure.
And after doing that for a decade, I realized I didn't want to be on somebody else's train anymore. Um, I wanted to be in a situation where I could affirm my own spiritual power and my own intuitive knowing, and look at what was true for me, regardless of whether it matched the narrative of a particular community or of my teacher. And so
Mhm.
that was how I ended up eventually parting from that community.
Mm. And what's become possible now that you've taken that step?
I think that I've had to really deepen my own intuition,
Mhm.
and my own connections with, I relate a lot with my dad. Um,
Mm.
I have a prayer practice, but I also really want to figure out what feels good for me. and what do I desire to do? And I think that in particular was a really interesting growth edge for me, because I had not learned to ask myself what I desired.
Mhm.
That was not a part of my previous spiritual practice. It was about letting go of desires or kind of being with what is. And so at first, it felt very frightening to be asking myself, what do I want? What feels good to me? And to kind of trust that that would lead me in a good direction, and that that would show me a spiritual approach that was going to work for me, as opposed to that it would cause me to be, indulgent or something like that. So developing that sense of trust and trusting my own desire was very important.
Mm. Yeah, I like to think of desire as little hints from the universe. Well, let me preface this by saying true desire, right? Not the sort of ego desire, not the sort of carnal pleasure desire, though some of those can help as well. But that our true desire, our desires that are coming from an authentic place, are little clues or hints from the universe that can guide us towards our highest calling, towards our highest path. In a sense, desires bring us into our highest path when we follow them in a good way. And so, yeah, I appreciate you acknowledging that there is a path that is more prescribed, that, with the Buddhist path, which is a perfectly legitimate spiritual path, it is much more structured and safe in a way. And that when we're able to step into this, I would call it a queerer path, that encompasses and embraces desire, then we start to look at a more direct relationship to spirituality, to ourselves, and to our intuition, and can find our paths and find our dharmas and find our highest purpose by sniffing out those desires and following them and seeing where they lead.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another thing that's kind of illustrated by that is that different things are medicine for us at different times.
Mhm.
So that previous community was the medicine I needed when I didn't have any containers for my life. And
Mhm.
then when I felt that I had other containers or had built up some kind of strength within myself, I needed different medicine. And I
Mhm.
think sometimes, when something's working for us, it seems like it's better, but it's really about the match between that practice and our needs, which are always changing.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I feel like the most interesting spiritual paths I hear about often involve many different modalities, many different practices, and that it's not about necessarily trying a bunch out in order to find the right one. It's about finding the medicine for you in that moment that
Right.
supports your evolution, that supports the evolution of your soul consciousness in that phase of your soul's consciousness. And sometimes that looks like something much more structured. Sometimes it looks like something completely chaotic and the opposite of structure. So I'm curious, was part of following your desire, was part of that your journey with gender, with your transition? And if so, I'd love to hear a little bit more about how that transition happened in the context of your spirituality.
I think that a lot of my transition I dealt with while I was still in the Buddhist community,
Hmm.
and that became, one word would be interesting. That became interesting because things were very different 10 plus years ago. And so they weren't ready to provide me with what I needed.
Mm,
So these things that seem fairly basic today around gendered accommodations, like what dorm I was going to sleep in, what bathroom I was going to use, these were all quite hot topics 12 years ago. And it was very painful.
mm,
And I think I really wanted to practice there. I felt that this was the right practice community for me. I liked the rigor, I liked the teachings. And so I really put up with a lot in terms of I was told your body would be a distraction for the other men. You can't stay in the men's dorm. Why can't you just change in the women's? Like a lot of really things that I think we might understand today as being incredibly problematic were considered much more normal then. And
Mhm.
I mean, this was in upstate New York, their monastery, and there was no New York State law protecting transgender people.
Mhm.
And so eventually through dialogue, we kind of came to a better place, and they have really actively worked on trans issues now. But
Mhm.
at the time, it was very difficult to have this essentially hierarchical environment where people are being held up as knowledgeable about spirituality,
Mhm.
who are like actively oppressing me.
Mhm.
And, when I would get angry about it, I would be talked to about like overcoming your anger or kind of letting it go. And so that was very difficult.
Mhm.
Um, and, looking back, I've asked myself, why did I stay around for that sort of thing?
Mhm.
And at the time, again, I just really felt like this was the right container for me, or that I had to put up with it in order to get these teachings. And
Mhm.
so that's an area of reflection for me about exactly how that came to happen.
Mhm.
One of the things that really did, however, change things for me towards the end was that I had tried to get pregnant in a previous relationship and it had not worked. And that was really the first time that I just wanted something really bad for years. And I worked on it, and every month, like I would work on it, I would hope, and like nothing would happen no matter like what I tried.
Mhm.
And that really changed my relationship with desire
Mhm.
and with linearity.
Mhm.
Because there were so many things before that I wanted, and maybe they didn't work out, but I had the sense like, oh, I could try again, I could work harder, like whatever thing. But this wasn't like that at all.
Got it.
And so I think that was a real shift for me.
Mm. And then you're pregnant now. So what shift, what happened? I mean, is there any, do you have a sense of what changed that made it
No, I
possible?
really don't know. It's pretty wild, actually. It really defies narrative expectations. So I was totally in a different narrative. I mean, I think you've grasped. I love thinking about the narrative containers we make to make sense of our lives.
Yeah.
And so after I couldn't get pregnant in this previous relationship, I was just like, okay, well, I'm really sad about that. I'm grieving that, but I'm gonna embrace my life without this in it. I'm gonna uh, focus on my writing. I'm gonna change jobs so I have more time for my writing. And so I was really kind of moving ahead with that. And I was open to getting pregnant, but I didn't think it was going to work because it like never worked before.
Mhm.
So I was very surprised. And then I didn't want to be in one of those narratives that's incredibly oppressive for queer people, where it's like, oh, well, as soon as you stop trying, that's when you're going to get pregnant. Because like that's not an option for so many people. It's very painful.
Mhm.
And so that's not how I think of it. But I'm not ready to pin a new narrative structure on that one right now, but that's what happened.
Wow, wild. And how has pregnancy been for you? And in what ways has it changed you?
I think that I I didn't realize how complicated I would feel.
Mm.
So, because again, we have this narrative like, oh, you have wanted to be pregnant in the past, so now you're pregnant, you must be like really happy about it every single day. And I'm very happy, but also, I had other plans of what I was going to do this year that I've had to sort of grieve those and let them go, which I'm fine to do, but it was a process.
Mhm.
Um, and then the other thing is that as a trans person, I didn't realize that my pregnancy would sort of reopen administrative issues that I thought were solved like a decade ago.
Okay.
Um, so I wrote an essay about this. What does it mean to be believed?
Hmm.
So, in the past couple of months, I have not been believed about what it says in my own passport, what it says in my own social security account. Like people are like, oh, you're confused, like you must be really female. And I'm like, I have this document literally in my hand and it literally says M on it. Do I seem like someone who would not be able to like read a letter on a passport that's like literally in my hand?
Wow.
So that's confusing to me. And it's really brought up for me this sense of, I feel that I benefited from a lot of like cisgender passing privilege. And
Mhm.
like suddenly now that I'm pregnant, I'm being like highly administratively scrutinized.
Mm.
Um, and in some ways, it has been helpful
Mhm.
because I'm like, oh, wow, like this person literally thinks I'm wrong about what's on my own passport. Like, I'm not going to take in anything from the system that's so clearly deeply confused.
Mm.
So it kind of reminds me like I'm right and I can have like this energetic boundary even as I'm dealing with a lot of sort of administrative problems, if that
I'm
makes
guessing these
sense.
are like medical professionals who are not able to fully grasp this idea of a man who is pregnant.
I have wonderful medical care providers. Actually, I'm very happy with all of them. But
Okay,
this has been like my insurance company and things like that.
got it. Okay.
Um, I
Mhm.
also had a travel agency book my flight in the wrong gender.
Oh, geez.
Um,
Sorry. Uh,
so
What do you
yeah.
see when you are confronting people, and maybe you don't resonate with that word, but it might occur for folks as confrontational, to experience you as a man who's also pregnant, who's going to be having a baby. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on the impact that you can have and what you represent as you move through that, if that resonates for you.
Well, I feel like I represent different things to different people.
Mm.
And that's why it's very important for me to stay grounded in my own story about what I represent to myself or
Yeah.
what story I want to be in, because I feel like I'm constantly invited into other people's stories. And sometimes we're invited into stories that are very beautiful and positive, like, oh, isn't it wonderful the world has gotten to this place, or things like that.
Mhm.
And just because a story is positive doesn't mean that if it's not authentic for you, that you have to take it on. And
Mhm.
those can kind of be a little bit more insidious. So
Mm.
I really have a practice of asking myself, do I want to be invited into this story? And if not, I just kind of don't give my energy in that direction. I
Mm.
think also as a culture, we invite pregnant people into a lot of really problematic stories. And so in some ways, it actually helps me that I don't look like a typical pregnant person, because then I kind of know like, oh, that's not for me.
Mm.
So for example, my Instagram is like full of these things of like, you should do your birth this way, you should be taking this supplement, like, and maybe if the people pictured in these ads were sort of aspirational for me, I would be like, oh, maybe I should, like, maybe I'm doing my pregnancy wrong. But that's not how I feel at all. I just feel like, oh, this is not for me. I'm not doing that. And so
Mm.
that can actually be very helpful.
Mm. Yeah, it strikes me as your path is, and I might be wrong, but I imagine you are one of the first folks to be openly trans man having a pregnancy. And I'm curious if that's true. First of all, I'm making that assumption, but I'm curious what that's like. Do you have role models? Do you have other folks who have shared this narrative that you can relate to and connect with, or how is it to be sort of a front man in this world?
So I will say, I think this is much more common than it looks.
No.
Not everyone wants to talk about it in public if they're going through it, but there are lots of trans folks who are pregnant right now, who have been pregnant, and I have really relied on some of them,
Oh.
either for advice or just looking to them as role models. I think there was one individual in 2008 who was incredibly public about his pregnancy. And so that exposed a lot of people to the idea, but also, again, things were very different in 2008, such that, the attention on him was very tabloid. And it's kind of painful for me to look at, so I try not to. But there are certainly, people who have done this in public more recently, who have really been generous about inviting the media in and kind of sharing their family in this like very intimate time with the public, in the hopes that this will help encourage understanding or encourage other trans folks. So I feel very grateful to a lot of those individuals and to other people that I'm in touch with. I do think that one of the things that I'm careful about for myself is that, again, it can be so easy to be invited into having a conversation about my pregnancy that I don't want to be having. And so trans people who are pregnant, like we might be asked like, oh, like, why did you want to be pregnant? Or, what led you to do this, or things like that. And so I have to ask myself, like, what conversations interest me about my pregnancy, and then only have those conversations. And so some of the conversations that interest me are what we're talking about cycles and narratives and things like that.
Beautiful. Yeah, and actually, I'd be curious to hear about any ideas you have around parenthood. Like, what when you think about parenthood, and maybe from a spiritual perspective, what do you feel called to do with this life, if it's something you've considered and thought about?
Well, those are some of my thoughts about parenthood and what I feel called to do in this life.
Do with this new life that you're
Oh,
bringing
yeah.
in. So I guess I'm curious
Yeah.
about conscious parenthood and any of your ideas on it.
Well, I don't know. I'm not there yet.
Sure.
And
Sorry.
I have these wonderful midwives who I ask them for, to recommend sort of a parenting advice book. And they really wanted to emphasize, like, you just have to show your kid you love them. Everything else, just like do what works for your family. But, you want to mess with your kid, make them wonder if you love them. Otherwise, it's okay. And so I was like, okay, well, I can do that. That feels very encouraging.
Yeah.
So I think I'll start there. And I think in general, culturally, there's, again, such an emphasis on like progress or being worthy. And so, having a child who just has to exist and you love them is actually just seems very beautiful to me. And I hope that opens up other ways of relating to the world more generally.
Beautiful. Yeah, I feel personally that unconditional love and acceptance is the greatest gift we can give our children. And
Yeah.
that so much of, and this is my personal perspective, I'm not a parent and I'm not pregnant and don't know if I'll have the blessing of a child. Maybe someday. I'm definitely open to it. It would be a huge blessing, I imagine. But I imagine my approach would be, to really focus on that unconditional love and acceptance, and to use those energies to help cultivate them into exactly who they are meant to be. That to do as much as I can to not try to formulate them or to control their development, and to simply allow them in their pure expression of self to just like that seed planted, to allow it to just form organically. And again, I'm certainly not a parent, but that's the gift that I imagine would be so exciting to offer.
Yeah.
And I love
Resonates.
when I do get to spend time with kids. I'm always just so excited to try my best to create space for them, to allow that pure essence, that pure light to come through. And it's always so magical when it does. It always brings me so much joy to be around that when I see them just in their full creative self-expression. It's so exciting to me. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And feeling that kind of joy on behalf of another is so wonderful as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, so I'm excited for your journey. I'm excited for your child. And it's interesting. I was just as I was asking you about parenthood, which I certainly hadn't planned to do, I was just thinking like, oh, it's like I don't imagine there's going to be a lot of times I'll be talking about parenthood on a queer spiritual podcast. So that's sort of where some of those curiosities were coming up for me. Yeah, any other thoughts that you have about sort of either maybe your transition from a spiritual context, or going into pregnancy from a spiritual context? Any other thoughts you feel like sharing?
Hmm.
Either of those areas?
Well, actually, I think one of the things that I think about a lot is how we relate to time and to ancestors, like, and people in the past and the future. And I think that sometimes it can feel, as queer people, that our history only goes back so far, or, especially as a trans person, I think that there are many narratives about being trans that really start sort of in the modern era with the availability of medical transition.
Mhm.
And so actually, I asked myself, like, what does it mean to feel like I've been given a narrative where, you know, modern trans people or whatever existed because hormone therapy existed? And
Mhm.
then when I take that and I actually apply it to pregnancy and birth, where, essentially people have been giving birth literally forever, but
Mhm.
then suddenly modern medicine comes in, they're like, we're going to deliver you of a baby. And like, now it has to be exactly like this.
Mm.
And of course, these days there's some pushback on that. There's different models of care, but that's how it sort of was basically from between when physicians edged out sort of the witches and healing women until fairly recently. And
Mhm.
so, kind of for me, looking at those parallels between the way that as a trans person, my story of like who I am or like what a transition is or what's available to me, and these ideas culturally about birth and like who has the agency in the process of birth, I feel that there's some resonance between those two.
Yeah, yeah. And so when you consider that resonance, what feels share a little bit, I'd love you to share a little bit more about that in relationship to the history of trans people that felt perhaps yeah, less so than it was.
I think that it was hard for me. There's sort of a sense of, oh, there are these deities going back that are maybe both, or in some respects, sort of archetypally trans. And
Mhm.
then, maybe they found a couple of people archaeologically who are sort of like the skeletons assigned sex seem different from what they were buried with. And
Mhm.
then it's like there's this like massive sort of disappearance from the historical record. We were there, we were probably passing. Um, I'm
Hmm.
very moved by the story of Frank Woodhull.
Hmm.
Um, Someone recently wrote about Frank Woodhull in Guernica, but this was a trans person who came through Ellis Island
Hmm.
and was, dressed as male. And it turned out they had been living as male for like 20 years.
Hmm.
And Ellis Island didn't know what to do with them. They were all over the news, but eventually they kind of left and disappeared from the historical record again. And I'm like, good for you. You had
Wow.
this like harrowing moment with the authorities trying to, because they couldn't deal with you. But then, like, literally, there were all these people at the tip of Manhattan trying to kind of gawk at them as they disembarked from Ellis Island. They took the ferry to Jersey
Wow.
because you can go either way. And they got on a train headed south, and like they're gone from the record. And
Work.
so, this is kind of the thing, is like when we're not in the historical record, it's often because we were happy and successful in whatever
Yeah.
way that looked for us. Um, but then when I was a Buddhist, a lot of people in my community were trying to look for more sort of binary gender equality. So a lot of people would put like a female Buddha on their altar. And I asked myself, like, what would a trans Buddha look like? Like,
Mm,
what would one that looks like me look like?
mm,
And I was very bothered that I couldn't really get a handle on it.
mm,
Um, because like I haven't had top surgery, so I can't just like draw scars on the chest or whatever and
mm,
have it look like me. And so that felt very difficult, is finding archetypes that work for me.
yeah, I can see that. And for me personally, I see so many of the deities as seemingly non-binary. And I mean, even the Buddha, when I think about it, it's not a very masculine or it's kind of somewhere in between, which is often where I land with spirituality, is that it is outside of the binary. And so it makes sense to me that a lot of these deities would represent that in aesthetic, that it's less masculine focused or feminine, that it's all things.
Yeah, and I think different, again, going back to the idea that we'll each find different medicine for ourselves,
Mm,
the that quality of the deities that you described allows each of us to kind of write our own story into it, and it
yeah,
can be different. Yeah.
yeah, that makes sense. And for me, it's a story, it's a non-binary story most of the time
Yeah.
as a non-binary person. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very cool. Yeah, well, anything else you'd like to share with our listeners today? We're kind of wrapping up, and yeah, anything else you feel like sharing, you feel moved to share with us?
Well, I think we covered a lot,
Yeah,
actually.
we
Yeah.
certainly did. Yeah, your story is really exciting, and I'm so grateful for you for being so generous in your sharing of it and all the wisdom and spaciousness that comes through in the sharing that you do. So thank you for your work.
Yeah. And thank you. I feel like you helped me to see a couple of things in a new light. I think this was a really rich conversation.
Wonderful. All right,
Thank you.
thanks again, and the wonderful day and blessings to this baby.
Thank you.